Massimo, we are live.
Thank you very much, Amanda. Welcome, everybody. I'm Massimo Tomasoli. I'm Director of Global Programs at International IDEA, and I will moderate today this event on the occasion of the launch of the global report of the SDG 16 Data Initiative. First of all, let me just say a couple of words about the initiative, and then I will introduce the panel. The initiative has been launched back in 2015, following the adoption of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, and it has a key focus on combining official and non-official data for monitoring progress on the implementation of SDG 16, and more broadly, also looking at the interlinkages between the implementation of SDG 16 and the rest of the SDG framework. It is an initiative carried out by an alliance of 18 organizations. Some of them are producing data, non-official data that are considered in combination with the official indicators selected by the UN to monitor progress on these important goal of the SDG framework. Others are analysts, and they aggregate data produced in their subject area, and we cover all the areas addressed by the SDG 16 and all of the targets. Every year, we produce a global report, and we also maintain an online website where you can check the indicators and do your own analysis if you are interested in that. The report of this year will focus on bringing out the interlinkages between SDG 16 and poverty eradication. So essentially the interlinkages between SDG 16 and SDG 1 and the broader ramifications of these connection. The panel we have today is a very interesting one, composed of my colleague John Romano, director of the TAP network based in New York. Thank you, John, for joining us. The TAP network has been one of the funders of the SDG 16 Data Initiative. Grace Holzman, Senior Research Associate at the World Justice Project. Welcome, Grace. Mike Rooney, advisor in the Democracy Assessment Unit that works in global programs at International IDEA. Hi, Mike. And Toby Mendel, Executive Director of the Center for Law and Democracy. These focus of this year on the linkages between the quality of institutions and the impact in terms of poverty and more broadly inequality has already been at the core of analysis carried out by the German Development Institute and UNDP in a report published in 2022. And that report already argued that the quality of governance institutions may be the booster shot, as they indicated, that we need to reduce poverty and inequality. We are going ahead on that line of analysis and research with various policy fora in mind. We want to speak to an audience that will be engaged next year in the second summit, the World Social Summit, the World Summit on Social Development. Very interesting appointment for comparing notes 30 years after the summit in Copenhagen. It will be also a very important year for the implementation of the 2030 Agenda. In the Pact for the Future, there is a paragraph that highlights the need to focus on the implementation of the agenda, scaling up investment in resources, and we'll look at the particular angle that the quality of democracy and the quality of governance institutions play in this respect. And let's not forget that in 2027, a summit will be convened in New York to take stock of the implementation of the 2030 agenda, already with a view and looking at beyond 2030. So let's not forget also that we are all engaged in this global conversation on achieving the goals and at the same time considering also what will come next. And all of these in the time of crisis. We are all aware of the impact of the current crisis on resources for development. There is also a financing for development process which is underway. The importance of investing for the achievement of the goals will be stressed also in that context, and we advocate proper attention to the broad policy areas covered by SDG 16. But without further ado, I want to give now the floor to the first speaker, who is John Romano, Director of the TAP Network. John, over to you.
Great. Thanks for that introduction, Massimo, and thanks to all of you for joining us. I know it's a week before a lot of us go on holidays, so really appreciate your time and joining us today. I think I'll just maybe start off just by building on a couple of things that Massimo had mentioned, mainly around the value of why non-official data for SDG 16 is important. I think from our perspective at the data initiative, non-official data can do a lot of things. I won't go into a whole lot of detail. I think those of us that are in this room here generally appreciate and know the value of non-official data, I would hope. But obviously, I mean, for us, the first thing is filling data gaps. I think with the challenges when it comes to monitoring and tracking progress towards SDG 16, there are many issues that are obviously very difficult to measure or sometimes politically sensitive that civil society in particular can help in filling some of these data gaps, and also important for accountability purposes as well. I mean, in addition to some of the benefits of non-official data that again we could have an entire session on, I think there are also some challenges that we've identified as well that I think would be good to also discuss here and going forward from this. I mean, the first thing is that data is expensive, unfortunately, especially the data that we want to try and collect. Experiential and perception-based data, survey-based data, that data is sometimes very expensive. And again, a big challenge for us is that generally speaking, funding is drying up, especially around data. It's drying up for national statistical offices themselves, but also for civil society and non-official data providers. I think that also makes it a lot more difficult for collaboration. Generally, we want to encourage collaboration between NSOs, national statistical offices, and non-official data sources. But less funding to go around also again makes that collaboration a little bit more difficult. I think one of the challenges as well, we have a challenge around crafting narratives around data. For those of us here, for example, data might be interesting and appealing, and we might be able to interpret data better than most, your average person. But I think we have to recognize that quantitative data assessments, for example, it may not be for everyone. I think we really need to think a little bit about how we translate this data, how we are sharing this data to people that we need this data and assessments to reach. And I think that's also, again, one of the values of the data initiative itself and of the report is that we try and help sensitize that data, help to understand what that actually means, and then provide some suggestions for moving forward. And I'll mention one initiative that we have done at the TAP Network. It's the SDG 16 Now campaign, a partnership of several dozen partners from civil society in the SDG 16 space. We produced last year the Halfway to 2030 report, which was a report from over 40 partners, some of the foremost experts on these issues from civil society. Provides data on SDG 16, but also some qualitative assessments of progress, which are also very necessary for tracking progress and accountability, but also recommendations on where to go from here. Report also includes a bit of storytelling, which will be my final point here. Is again, I think we need to do a little bit more, and I think we need to do better storytelling as a community and in general around the SDGs. This is something I think, again, qualitative assessments of progress, storytelling. This is a lot more, we'll be doing a lot more of this in the year to come, including through the launch of a new SDG 16 storytelling initiative that will also launch next year. So we hope, if these are areas of interest to you and your organization, we would love to help share your stories, your experiences in working around SDG 16. Right now, you can just join the SDG 16 Now campaign. We'll have much more information about the storytelling initiative that we'll launch first thing next year. So really easy to find. It's just sdg16.org. You can join the community, and we would really look forward to, again, kind of doubling down on that storytelling of, again, the wide range of experience that comes from civil society. It can be around data, it can be around implementation, accountability, monitoring, all of those things. So really look forward to those of you that are interested in the storytelling side of things to join us next year, especially as we double down on these storytelling efforts. So I'll include a little bit more in the chat box as well, but I'll stop there. Thanks, Massimo.
Thanks a lot, John, for reminding us the focus and mandate, the challenges also, but the great value in this initiative. Let us now get a little bit more into the contents and the substance of this year's report, and I will start with Grace Holzman, Senior Research Associate at the World Justice Project. Grace, you have the floor.
Thank you, Massimo, and thank you everyone for joining us today. As Massimo mentioned, I work for the World Justice Project, which is a multidisciplinary independent organization based in Washington, D.C. And we work to advance the rule of law through a few different avenues, including research. And I have drawn on some of the WJP's research for the development of Chapter 2 of this year's report, which focuses on the intersections between strengthening the rule of law and access to justice, as well as the eradication of poverty. There are 2 points I want to highlight here at the top of this conversation. The first is that research from the WJP has found that there is a bidirectional relationship between injustice and poverty, which underscores the point about the interlinkages between SDG 16, particularly Target 16.3, and SDG 1. At the individual level, the WJP has found that people who are experiencing poverty may be more vulnerable to injustice. And when they then experience that injustice, people living in poverty tend to be more likely to encounter barriers to justice and experience negative consequences as a result. At the national level, data from the WJP Rule of Law Index suggests that limited economic resources are associated with lower adherence to the rule of law. So, for example, in the 2023 iteration of the WJP Rule of Law Index, high and upper middle income countries, on average, score higher than low and lower middle income countries, both on the index overall, as well as Factor 7 on civil justice and Factor 8 on criminal justice. The second point I'll make, and this ties into a point that John was making, is that there continue to be really persistent gaps in the availability of data on SDG 16, including Target 16.3. And while there is knowledge from the civil society space, unofficial data, such as that which I just pointed to, there is a need for more emphasis on collecting official data as well. So, for example, there are 3 indicators in Target 16.3, and one of the indicators, which measures access to dispute resolution, only had 6 countries that have ever reported any data on it to the SDG indicators database. And this lack of information makes it really challenging for policymakers and advocates and decision makers to first identify what problems exist and then to develop informed and evidence-based solutions in response to them. The lack of official data is even more dire when you consider the fact that there is almost no official data reported in the SDG indicators database for target 16.3 that's poverty disaggregated. So this makes it really challenging to understand what the relationship is between poverty, access to justice, and the rule of law in a number of countries. So the last thing I'll just say to conclude these remarks is that what I have found and the message I've reiterated in my chapter, which I think crosscuts this report overall, is that there remains a really urgent need for action around SDG 16, and that action needs to be really closely tied with other facets of the 2030 agenda, including SDG 1. As policymakers look to set their agendas for 2025, it's critically important to emphasize these SDGs, recognizing that they form a cornerstone in the achievement of sustainable and inclusive progress for all. I want to reiterate John's point as well about collaboration and partnership between official and non-official actors is really critical to ensuring that this progress is really inclusive and just for all. So that's the last thing I'll say now. Massimo, back to you. Thank you.
Well, thanks a lot, Grace. You raised very, very important issues, and the disaggregation of data has been always in the mind of the policymakers who decided to agree on the 2030 agenda, and yet it becomes and still is a major challenge. And you highlighted very well how these impacts on the definition of evidence-based policies to address the linkages, the crucial linkages between the rule of law and poverty reduction. Let me now move on to my colleague Mike Rooney, advisor at the Democracy Assessment Unit in Global Programs at International IDEA. Mike, over to you.
No, thank you very much, Massimo. So our contribution to the report this year was along similar lines, our overarching theme of the integral role of SDG 16 in efforts to eradicate poverty. Our research using our Global State of Democracy indices showed relatively similar results to what Grace described in the World Justice Projects and their work. And we also have a special focus story on Chile that we encourage people to read. But we also, in addition to seeing what we have in terms of our non-official data, we also do collect a lot of data about how different social groups understand democracy and how they perceive it, including things like the rule of law and access to justice. And our focus is found, and our research has found, that poverty is kind of both a source of skepticism and a consequence of weak democratic institutions, of courts, of unrepresentative parliaments, and so on and so forth. So it sounds a bit like the snake eating its own tail, the Ouroboros, but we see poverty as both a negative consequence of these weak institutions and as well as a factor contributing to the loss of public faith in them, therefore undermining democracy itself. Of course, this came a little bit too late for us to address it specifically in this report, but economists have also rewarded themselves for discovering this again this year by giving a Nobel Prize in economics to Robinson, Johnson, and Acemoglu, who are working on the importance of institutions for economic development. So you may say this is nothing new, and that's fair. The reason that we think that it is important to have this conversation in the context of the SDGs, and as Massimo mentioned at the outset, in regards to the Pact of the Future and the upcoming high-level political forum, is that one country's democratic institutions are not set off via like an autoclave or even a Chinese wall from other ones. We won't say that all institutions are a set of the same institutions, but they are part of the same overlapping system across international borders. This is why we stress that there's a problem of finance in addressing the 8 SDG 16s. So the institutions that are failing citizens of one country may also be implicitly benefiting the ones of another. So this requires a collective response. And that's what we're trying to bring out in the report. But I'm going to keep my comments brief right now because we still have to hear from Toby, and then we're going to have a discussion, and we'd love to hear from you in the rest of this meeting.
Thanks a lot, Mike. Again, interesting what you said about the perception and the role that poverty plays, both as a factor contributing to reducing the confidence in institutions, and at the same time, the result of the working or failure to work of weak institutions. Now, let me give the floor to Toby Mendel, Executive Director at the Center for Law and Democracy, and also a co-author of this report. Toby, over to you.
Thanks so much, Massimo. And I'm going to focus my comments on SDG Indicator 16.10.2, which is the adoption and implementation of laws giving individuals the right to access information held by public authorities, or what we call for short the right to information. And I really loved the phrase you used at the beginning, Massimo, this idea that SDG 16 could be a booster shot, for anti-poverty or for poverty alleviation efforts. I found that very evocative and wonderful. But SDG 16 can only do that if it itself is being boosted, if I can use that term again. If we're not achieving the SDG 16 targets and indicators, then it can't be a booster shot because it isn't itself thriving. So I will talk a little bit about how it's going with 16.10.2. We started the SDGs with 86 of the 193 UN members not having laws guaranteeing this right. Today, we are at the number of 56 countries which don't have those laws. So we've made some progress, but we're nowhere near, we're past the halfway point, and we're nowhere near halfway to cutting the numbers. And in the last 10 years, only 10 countries, so 2 per year, have adopted laws. So we're not on target if we continue at this pace, even to have the number of countries without laws by the end of the SDG period. So we're not getting the boost on that side that we need to be a booster shot for other SDGs, and particularly poverty alleviation. For the 137 countries that do have laws, then the question becomes, how well are they doing in terms of implementing those laws? And I mean, for the adoption of laws, my own organization produces very high quality, continuously updated data, so we know exactly not only which countries have laws, but exactly how strong those laws are. But the situation is very different when it comes to implementation. And there, I think, Grace gave us some rather shocking statistics about official data in terms of access to justice. We have the same problem in terms of implementation. So we don't really, we're essentially flying blind on that issue. We don't really know how well implementation is going. UNESCO does have a methodology for assessing a little bit what's going on in that space, but it's not very reliable, and a lot of countries don't answer it anyway. I would like to just spend a couple of minutes talking about the nature of that booster shot in terms of access to information. And there's an abundance of very strong official statements about how transparency is a key ingredient in the fight against poverty. And those statements are made by the UNDP, by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and the UN, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and by a lot of other actors. I would point to 3 particular drivers of that. And the first is that transparency significantly reduces, or is a significant tool in the fight against corruption. And corruption has been shown time and again to disproportionately affect the poor. The second causal factor that I would identify is the role of access to information in terms of holding governments to account. So when governments put in place development policies, often aimed at the poor, if those policies are not working, are getting diverted, are not reaching their targets, the access to information is a very important corrective in addressing those problems and in improving the design of the policies in the first place, but also making sure that they are, getting implemented as they were designed and reaching the poor as they were intended to do. So another causal link. And then the third one, which is quite related to that, is the role of access to information in terms of boosting participation. And if the poor are unable to participate in the design of development projects, those projects are unlikely to meet the real needs of the poor. So boosting participation through access to information is another, causal link between these two rights. So I'll stop with those initial comments and look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thanks a lot, Toby. I don't want to take credit for the term booster shot, because that is the merit, in fact, of UNDP and the German Development Institute that first used it 3 years ago. But a very, very interesting line of argument on your side. The SDG 16 itself needs to be boosted in order for it to be a booster shot. Very good point. Now, we had already some questions in the chat on our chat here. And I just wonder whether in the WebEx link, and I just wonder whether some of the panelists want to answer to those questions. First of all, there was a cluster of questions addressed to John about the importance and limits and also the power of storytelling, which is the point you alluded to at the end of your intervention. We had a comment from Asim Andrews about the fact that storytelling is an approach that is not inherently new. So what would be the novelty, the innovation in that? And also an endorsement, I would say, from Chris, who stressed that the general public is not aware of the SDGs, and storytelling, more storytelling, as you proposed, is most welcome. So what do you have to say about that?
Great, thanks, Massimo. Yeah, I'll be brief. I think, yeah, it's a fair point that storytelling isn't new. I mean, let's be honest with ourselves here, is that all of us are storytellers in the work that we do, whether it's you work on data collection and aggregation, things like that, on the back end of data collection, or if you work in advocacy. I think all of us in some way or another are storytellers, and we're, I think from the SDG 16 data initiative side of things, I think, as I mentioned at the beginning, is that our objective really is to sensitize these issues to a wider audience. And I think part of the point of storytelling efforts that we'll engage with from here is an effort to sensitize these issues to those that may not know about these issues or may not care necessarily. It's that question of how do we reach a broader audience to get more people engaged in discussions that impact their lives, that they, again, may not know about or may not care about. And there's many ways now, I think, especially in today's times, our methods of storytelling in general within our societies have changed quite dramatically, even in the past few years even. I'm not, like, for example, I'm not a TikTok user or supporter personally. Maybe that ages me, but I think just recognizing even things like that, how do we engage through social media and storytelling efforts of that to reach a younger audience, for example, and how do we meet people where they digest information? And I think that's a challenge that I think requires us to think a little bit outside the box of the more traditional storytelling that we may do, blogs or video stories. How do we make sure that reaches the audiences that we're really intending, or we need to be engaged in this agenda? Again, that's just one example. Young people, how do we engage with young people as an example? We could go on about storytelling and different ways to do it and the value of it. So happy to also unpack this a little bit further in some of the discussion from here, but I'll stop there for now.
Thanks, John. Toby wants to add something, please.
I just want to reinforce what John said. I mean, of course, storytelling is not new. It goes back to the dawn of time, but it is a very powerful advocacy tool in the end of the day for those of us in civil society. I can say for sure that, looking at access to information, there are a few countries where there's enormously powerful stories about the benefits that RTI can deliver have emerged, and they just swept around the country. And in those countries, everybody knows about that issue. Everybody understands the importance of it. They can relate to those stories personally, and that just it gives a kind of a boost to these things that advertising can't buy, as it were. It is the way that we're going to reach people. And I mean, John's right that we need to use the modalities, the modern modalities for communicating with people. But the power of stories, I think, is unchanged over millennia, and they drive our world in a lot of ways.
Absolutely, Toby. I agree with both you and John. If I may add on these, and then I will ask a question to Grace in the chat. Well, I may add two things here, that we need a story to tell for effective storytelling, and this initiative is bringing stories that are based on evidence, on data, and think, for example, of the analysis of the perception of democracy and the delivery side of democracy that Mike referred to in his intervention. These are data that, especially in the vacuum that exists still now in terms of disaggregation of these data by marginalized groups, for example, international ideas analysis disaggregated these perceptions by marginalized groups in 19 countries. I think this brings a lot of powerful stories to the fore. And the second aspect I would say is that storytelling should also break the walls and reach out to the conventional closed circuits of those working on these issues. Sometimes I feel like we are communicating within bubbles, and we have to break those bubbles down, get out of the bubble, and reach out through effective communication by using good stories, as you both said, is an effective mean. Even if it is not necessarily a new idea, it could be done in innovative terms, especially with new technologies. Now, let me get back to Grace. As I announced, there was a question for you in the chat from Felix Holman. What opportunities are there for civil society to contribute data, evidence, case studies in relation to the impact of poverty and the barriers to accessing justice? And then he also highlighted with a follow-up question, especially with respect to some groups like, for example, children separated from families, children in street situations, and so forth. Grace.
Thank you, Massimo. And Felix, thank you so much for the question. So to be transparent, I can't speak specifically about work around children and children who have been separated from their families or who are living in street situations, because it's not my area of expertise. So I don't want to misspeak on that. But I would say broadly to your question, there definitely are some really great opportunities for civil society to get involved in knowledge generation and sharing. And I want to highlight actually two of our partners here in the SDG 16 data initiative. So I had mentioned in the chat, the first one that came to mind actually is the TAP network, who John is representing here. And the second that I'll highlight is Namati, who's one of the members of the data initiative. And both TAP and Namati in different ways seek to bring together civil society actors who are working to advance justice, action, and policy around these topics. So I can put the link for Namati's Grassroots Justice Network in the chat. Again, I don't work for Namati, so I'm not claiming any expertise on that, but they just come to mind as an organization that's doing some really great convening work, especially at the grassroots, to bring together people and entities that have information and insights to be shared. So that might be an interesting place to start. And I would welcome, John, if you have anything to add, or Toby or Mike, any other ideas, I'd welcome them as well.
Yes, John?
No, I I would have said the exact same thing as Grace and forwarded colleagues onto Namati. A really great network, not just an organization that works on these issues, but a really great network that they facilitate as well. A lot of also colleagues that you can also work with. I think that's part of the value of a network, is to also help identify some other partners that may work on these issues or work in different regions or countries. I think a great resource there to not only tap into Namati's work in general, but also to maybe connect with other partners working on some of the issues that you really care about. So again, a strong endorsement of Namati in the global legal empowerment network.
Thank you very much. There is another question again from the chat, probably addressed to Toby, but to any of you who wants to answer as well, from Dunga. We are already struggling with transparency, Durga say. How can we bring stories when there is already so much suppression? So how can this speaks to your first driver? No, I think, Toby, transparency as a fight against corruption. But what if the space for information is actually closed? And we all know that the space for civil society action and the media is really shrinking. So what's your reaction to that?
So first of all, I will strongly endorse this idea of a shrinking space for, access to information, for freedom of expression, and for democracy generally. And I mean, I've been working for civil society for 30 years, and for, the first 20 years of that, every year, the organization I was working for was going on about how space was shrinking and rights were rolling back, and actually it was the opposite. There was actually a lot of progress being made around the world. But the last 10 years, that claim has unfortunately really become true. So I mean, I think we need to. I'm making that point because I think we need to separate a little bit some of the buzz around the issue and then the reality. And it's really true now. We are seeing shrinking space for that. But for me, I mean, of course, if you live in a country where the space is so closed that you actually face risks if you bring stories about protecting human rights. I mean, and there are countries like that. Of course, that is very, very challenging. Although still, the plurality of mechanisms or modes of communication that John talked about do still provide avenues for that. Maybe you can't, identify that you're coming from that country. You have to hide a little bit behind a cloak of anonymity, but you still can get stories out. But otherwise, for me, the attack on democracy and the closing space, civic space, and all of those challenges that we're facing highlights the renewed importance for us all to talk about, to bring those stories and to fight that. I mean, we are in a challenging time, and that means that we have to fight harder and more valiantly, than before, and we absolutely can't sort of get overwhelmed by the negative, and as difficult as that is sometimes, that we need to keep up the good fight, as it were, and there are a lot of people around the world doing that, and the more people that join us and things, then the stronger we will be. And I mean, I can't predict what's going to happen in Syria, but at least they got rid of a duo of brutal dictators that had run the country for nearly 55 years, opening up the possibility of something more hopeful coming in. So I think there are always some bright spots around the world, and we need to keep fighting for them.
Thanks a lot, Toby, and of course any of the panelists may jump into this conversation if you want to add anything more. I have another question that is addressed to all panelists, and this is: what were the most surprising findings you have found in your data for this year's report? And I would say surprising could be in any way. Let's say surprising because they are highlighting new trends or because they highlight factors that were unexpected to some extent. But I would think of also the key findings that you feel should highlight this year's report in your view and in your respective areas. Can you name just one each, perhaps? Who wants to start? Yes, Toby.
Well, I mean, I'm speaking a lot, but I mean, to be perfectly honest, and I mean, this is not perhaps not the answer that the person asking the question was looking for, but I would have loved to have found some surprises in the data for this year, because a surprise is better than nothing. But I mean, almost nothing in our data was new or different or surprising. You know, it kind of same old, and it, you know, including the lack of progress in moving forward on you know, protection for fundamental human rights and access to information, which is SDG 1610. You know, no diversion really from the rather depressing trend that we've been on for the last few years.
One point Grace made in her intervention is this persistent gap in data. So here the finding maybe is not surprising, especially if you think of the fact that for some indicators it took a long time to agree precisely on what should be included and how it should be actually measured and so on and so forth. So there were technicalities also around their adoption in the end. But what do you think should be done in order to bridge that gap, especially considering that we are 10 years past the approval of the SDGs? Yes, Toby again.
So someone else is jumping in. Let me jump in again. I mean, I think that one of the innovations that we're seeing, not in our data, but in general on access to information, is this idea. So part of access to information is the obligation of governments to proactively disclose information. So not only respond to requests for information, but also push out information. And one of the emerging themes in that area is indeed this idea that governments are obliged to disaggregate data, so that you know, it's not just enough to sort of, you know, I mean, I don't know, I can't think of a better example, but I'm here in Cambodia right now, and we were talking all day about car accidents and people getting killed by car accidents. So it's not enough to keep statistics on car accidents. That information needs to be disaggregated by along various lines, certainly gender, but also, for example, you know, by area and region of the country. So, you know, is the capital city the main source of this problem, or it's, you know, on the highways or whatever. This and you know, are poor people more vulnerable? Going to our theme, you know, are persons with disabilities. I mean, I think this idea that, you know, addressing inequality is a fundamental obligation of governments. To address problems, you need information, so you need to disaggregate that information. And I mean, gender, and Grace talked a little bit about how there's, you know, almost no I mean, there's the very scarce data anyway, but you know, even scarcer when it comes to gender and other forms of disaggregation. But this idea that, you know, part of the human right to information, part of the obligation on governments to be open and to be transparent and to, you know, share information with people includes a disaggregated element. And I think that has quite a lot of legs, if I can put it that way. I think, you know, that may develop strongly over the coming years, and I think it's quite an interesting idea.
There is, in fact, a follow-up question in the chat, Toby, and again, any of the panelists may try to answer to that. One surprise is to see, this is from Francisco, one surprise is to see that the indicators of the SDGs are in general not disaggregated for women and men. What I saw in SDG 16, for example, violence and homicides, or young women opportunities for labor participation without violence at work and home. So disaggregation is not only about gender, but the gender dimension is most prominent when it comes to disaggregation. What are your thoughts about that? How can we be better at disaggregating? What should we do more in order to get those data?
I'd be happy to
So-
jump in here,
Yes,
Massimo.
great.
Francisco, thank you for the question. And I think, more broadly to an earlier question in the chat about what surprised me most, I do think one thing that surprised me this year, even though I know it has been in common trend, is I was genuinely surprised by the lack of poverty disaggregated data on target 16.3. And to note, for those who may not be as familiar with the minutia of it all, but for each of the SDG indicators, there is guidance on how the specific indicator should be disaggregated. And granted, it is easier said than done to obtain systematic disaggregated data. I think John made a point earlier on in this conversation about the expense that's associated with it. But I was disappointed to see how little. I actually think no countries had reported poverty disaggregated data for target 16.3 in the database. So that lack of information, as I had said, really impedes our understanding. And Francisco, to your question on, obviously poverty is not the only factor at play here. There's a lot of facets of vulnerability that can come into play, gender being one of them. And at least for target 16.3, there's some gender disaggregated data available. For example, about 100 countries have reported gender disaggregated data on the indicator specifically about pretrial detainment. However, again, it varies a lot by indicator, and I'm sure with the other indicators beyond target 16.3, there's similarly a lack of data. To your point, Massimo, about what we can do about this, I think there are a few different routes, but one thing that I would emphasize here is that this lack of official data, again, points to the need for civil society partners to continue to contribute and generate as they're able to non-official data, because that non-official data really can help fill these gaps. And furthermore, especially when we're thinking about people and populations that may be disproportionately vulnerable, unofficial data from those communities can offer really important insights into people's lived experiences. So that would be, I guess, my comment on it. But again, just reiterating, we really do need more disaggregated data, and we need to embrace varied sources of that data, ideally to bring it together to offer a more well-rounded and informed picture of what the current status is.
Thanks, Grace. Now, Toby.
Yeah, I just want to sort of unpack a little bit this idea that it's costly to disaggregate, because I think that that's sometimes true, but often not true. So, for example, you talked about pretrial detention. To collect gender disaggregated information about that is, I mean, not difficult at all. You just have to do it. I mean, and so if you, I mean, I think that a lot of this is that, often states just simply don't think about it, don't have in place the systems. You register, you detain somebody, you collect a bunch of information on them, and you should, provide that but maybe, for example, to disaggregate on the basis of poverty for pretrial detention would be more difficult, because you'd have to kind of start looking into things which weren't that apparent and weren't part of the, weren't automatically part of the detention process, like asking, whether somebody's poor or not, slightly more, and there may actually be privacy and other implications of that. But I think that a lot of we could move an awfully long way in terms of disaggregated data simply by putting in place fairly simple systems for tracking, the whatever disaggregation factor you're looking at. Persons with disabilities, minority status, gender. Those ones are often not so hard, I think, to collect. You just need to kind of do it, as you're going about collecting data on the issue. Of course, if you're not collecting data at all, then that's a different question. Yeah.
Thank you, Toby. And I would like to recall one thing. Oh, yes, John wants to talk. Yes, John.
Thanks, Massimo. Yeah, just also just to build on what Grace and Toby have also just mentioned about disaggregation. I think also it's important to remember that in a lot of countries, it's also illegal to collect certain data about individuals. So I think that's also a challenge that I think needs to be addressed in different contexts, and also a question about, do we necessarily want data to be collected about sometimes politicized ethnic or minority groups, for example? Can that then also be weaponized against citizens in countries that, again, may look unfavorably upon a certain group or demographic? That's, I think, something that we should think about, not necessarily applying a data disaggregation lens all across the board, but obviously more nuanced conversations about where it's necessary and where it can be beneficial. I'm sure we could unpack this in a webinar on its own. There's a lot to unpack there, but I also just wanted to maybe tackle the question about one thing I was surprised by. It wasn't included in this report because Edelman isn't one of our data initiative partners. But one thing I found interesting from this past year was from the Edelman Trust Barometer. They do amazing work to collect people's sentiments from around the world on many topics relevant in a given year. And I think one of the questions they asked people were about how much they trust different sources of information to tell them, I think it was about new innovation or technologies. And people responded that they trust people like me at the same level as the rate that they trust scientists to tell them about new technologies and innovations. And some similar findings around people digesting information, political information, for example. People wanted to hear, or they trusted someone like them more so than they trusted doctors or scientists or anyone else that should be otherwise a reliable source of information on some of these topics, experts, I guess you can say. I think that really speaks to, I think, how people are digesting information, how people are accessing their information and ideas. And again, kind of goes back to that storytelling aspect of what we were talking about before, is how do we make some of these things resonate with different audiences and not be the proverbial experts that may not know how to. I think Edelman also had a question about, do you trust scientists to tell you about some of these things? And I think in a disturbingly high amount of countries, I think the majority of people said that scientists didn't know how to communicate with them. So I think some of these things are really kind of insightful, helping us think about, again, as you mentioned, Toby, how do we get out of our bubble? Sorry, Massimo, you mentioned our bubbles that we sometimes operate in. I think this is something just kind of that illustrated where some of those bubbles may be and the importance of, again, how do we communicate better with people in ways that resonate better with them? There's a lot more information on the Edelman Trust Barometer, really interesting information as well. I'll put in the chat box as well.
Thanks a lot. In fact, in the chat, Mike has already put also a link to the report that we are launching today, and I would recommend everybody to have a look at it. It's available at the moment in the International Ideas website. And this is a report, as I say, that is produced every year. And looking at the collection of reports over the years, it's very interesting to see the trajectory, the positives, and also the challenges in the implementation of these SDG 16. Now, I was about to say before, giving the floor to John, that John himself made reference to the role of national statistical offices in his presentation. And I think that disaggregation of data is also a very important responsibility of these agencies. And the disaggregation is not only by groups, but it's important, especially when looking at poverty patterns and trends at the geographical disaggregation of data. Otherwise, we will look at national trends. So the subnational analysis of the situation is also extremely important in order to account for inequalities within the country when it comes to the implementation of the 2030 agenda. And before wrapping up, because we are now 3 minutes close to the end of this launch, I want to give you an opportunity for some final words, one each, in the reverse order. And I will start then with Toby, going back to John. Toby, what is the key takeaway you want to share with us?
I'm going to come back to your booster shot idea and my gloss on that. I mean, you know, we have seen report after report after report, year after year after year, about how we are absolutely not. I mean, we're not only not achieving or making progress on SDG 16. In some cases, we're actually backsliding. And you know, or the progress is very, very limited. We just need a lot more effort and you know, work on SDG 16 on all of the targets and indicators. And I mean, you know, that's just a crisis that we're in the world, and governments need to do a lot more and a lot better.
Thank you, Toby. Mike, any final thoughts about this launch?
No, I cannot disagree with Toby at all, and I would like to reiterate the call about taking seriously disaggregation and subnational data on these issues more seriously. As John rightly noted, there are pitfalls for the governments that use this sort of data to target certain minorities. There's a lot of resistance in a lot of European countries to doing this at all. But I think that the good that we can do and the better picture that we have of the world can be greatly, can be greatly improved. So I hope that we can push forward this. I think it would help work towards SDG 16 and hopefully, but of course, the most important thing is renewed global attention and finance to make this a reality.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mike. Grace, your final thoughts.
Thank you, Massimo. I think, you know, my main takeaway from this conversation and the process of producing this report and working with all the members of the data initiative is that we really do need a multi-prong approach to advancing SDG 16, and that includes, as we've discussed, the need for more data, the need for better data, for disaggregated data. It also means that there should be movement as far as advocacy and partnership among organizations at various levels. So I think looking ahead to 2025 and, you know, all that is to come, for me, what stands out is this need for renewed action, for multifaceted action, and for action that recognizes that ultimately, if we fail to eliminate poverty, we are also failing to ensure access to justice and the rule of law, because that interconnection is very close and one cannot be achieved without the other.
Thanks, Grace. John, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Massimo. Thanks, everyone. I think for, all of the calls we just heard about joint action, I think that's something that we'll lean quite heavily into with the SDG 16 Now campaign going forward. So welcome all of you to join us in that mobilization. But also something that Michael just mentioned as well is on the finance side of things. I think that's something that we need to do more of in terms of selling why data is important. I think, again, with a lack of funding generally in development spaces overall, there's an opportunity in front of us next year with the 4th International Conference on Financing for Development to also maybe make the pitch for why more investments in data are needed and get member states and donors to commit to more funding for data. And that's all across the board. It's for non-official data. It's for national statistical offices. It's for UN entities that help to bring all of this together as well. I think, what is it? The saying says, a rising tide raises all boats. I think that's really what we need right now, is just broad investments in data across the board. And maybe an opportunity next year at the Financing for Development Conference to mobilize our joint advocacy for that.
Thank you very much, John. And my key takeaway here is really the value of partnership. This is an initiative that is based on the work that each and every one of the 18 member institutions is investing mostly from their core resources. And this is something very important because it preserves the independence of this initiative, but it builds also partnerships with other institutions and alliances that have been mentioned in these presentations that work in this very important space, SDG 16, as an enabler and the goal in itself for the 2030 agenda. Let me conclude this launch by thanking every panelist for their insightful presentations, the participants who posed the questions, those who participated and followed either on WebEx and on the YouTube channel, and last but not least, my colleagues from the New York Office of International IDEA who made all of these possible, and in particular, Amanda Surek. Thank you very much. Happy holidays for everybody, and let's keep fighting for better data and integrating informal and formal indicators for monitoring progress on this important goal of the agenda. Thank you.
Thank you.